Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this next Chatham House session, which we have currently to be able to discuss the future of the WTO, and in particular our ability to be able to talk to each of the speakers who have been with us over these last few weeks. The candidates that we've already had the pleasure of being able to have conversations with have included Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, Amina Mohammed, Jesus Sisiade in the last 4 weeks or so specifically, and a great opportunity now for us to be able to have a conversation with Dr. Liam Fox. And I'm thrilled, Liam, that you've been able to join us today. We're going to hard stop at 1 o'clock because Liam Fox has a number of other calls, I suspect, to be able to make to keep himself on this very tight timeline of all the candidates to get their visions and their ideas shared with the member states who are all going to be making their decisions as to who will take over from Roberto Azevêdo when he steps down actually formally at the end of this month. I just want to say very quickly as well, this is the Chatham House centenary year, and as an institute we were involved back in the 40s in helping thinking about the future global multilateral trade system. So to have this opportunity in our centenary year to host this conversation, we've had a global trade policy forum, which is running on through all of 2020 and will run into 2021. And therefore to have this opportunity now to speak as well and go into the big topic of the future of the global trading system with each of these candidates is a real privilege. And Liam, I want to say, Liam Fox, a huge pleasure for you to be with us again in this guise. You've spoken at Chatham House in the past in your other positions. Just as a quick couple of words of introduction, Dr. Liam Fox joined Parliament as a Member of Parliament back in 1992, so therefore somebody who brings a lot of political experience in the shadow cabinet, so he knows what it's like to be on the shadow side, but then served as Secretary of State for Defence, 2010 to 11, and then most relevantly for this role as Secretary of State for International Trade for 3 years from 2016 through the summer of 2019. So if I may, I will say Liam Fox. Liam, if I may call you Liam, as we do know each other, it'd be a little strange. Please Robin me in return, as I know you will. But just let's try and set the scene at the moment, because you're somebody who I think of always as very much a free trader. I think you've described yourself as somebody who believes very much in the benefits of free trade. Could you just share a little bit with us, just to kick off, your kind of philosophy about international trade, the role it plays in international prosperity and security? How do you, what's your vision of trade? Because it's a very contested world today, maybe a lot more contested than it was 5 or 6 years ago. Just share with us a few opening thoughts, Bill Liam.
Yeah, well, thank you, Robin, and congratulations on 100 years. Let's hope that the WTO lasts that length of time. It's the objective of many of us to ensure that it does. Well, first of all, I think that you allude to one of the great benefits of global trade. We have managed to take, through an open trading system, 1 billion of our fellow human beings out of extreme poverty in a generation. One of the greatest achievements, I think, in human history. Why? Because we looked at the concepts economically behind free trade of comparative advantage, but how we could use them in a shared endeavor, in a multilateral way, so that we could make compromises at nation state level for the greater good. And that greater good certainly came to be realized. So I think that the proof is already there, that if we have the political will to take it forward and the vision to take it forward, it can be achieved. But I would say there is something else about trade that needs to be recognized. And that is, if we didn't understand before COVID that we live in a very interconnected and interdependent world, then we certainly do so now. And we need to understand, therefore, that trade is not an end in itself. Trade is a means by which we help spread and create prosperity around the globe. And that's important because that prosperity underpins social cohesion. Social cohesion underpins political stability. And that political stability is the building block of our collective security. In other words, it's a continuum that you cannot break without there being severe consequences. So if you want to apply protectionist measures, you need to understand that if you deny people the access to poverty through trade, you cannot be surprised if you get more mass migration or you get more political radicalization or other consequences that may come from the emergence of failed states. And I think it's understanding that we can bring these huge advantages to the global prosperity and stability through multilateral trade, but to try to block it in an era where we have this interdependence is likely to have consequences for us all in terms of security. And I say that with both my experience as Defense Secretary and Trade Secretary. In the modern world, we cannot differentiate in the way that perhaps we were able to do in the past between what is over here and what is over there.
Very important point you said at the beginning about trade having helped bring 1 billion people out of poverty. But as you said, trade is not an end in itself. I'm wondering how you deal with the accusation these days that while 1 billion people may be brought out of poverty, many people in the developed world, the countries that, let's say, were at the front end of globalization, many of them have felt that trade actually has undermined their prosperity and ultimately their human security within their own countries. I remember President Trump's inaugural speech talking about the tombstones dotted across America, which he believes were driven very much by unfair trade, that in a way trade had sucked the jobs out of America. And there are many people who've held similar views across Europe. And I suppose there's a risk at some point, maybe even the developing world will start to think this as well. How do you counter this idea that trade, while it's helped some people out of poverty, has thrown other people into poverty or made their lives feel more insecure?
I think it's a failure to understand the benefits that actually come from free and open trade. When you think about in the developed world, we take all the benefits of free trade for granted. We seem to think only about some of the downsides that might exist. You go to a supermarket and have a look around you and then decide what would be on the shelves if we didn't trade with the United States, with Europe, with Africa, with Asia. We have taken completely for granted that basic things like food now are available to us all year, different types of foodstuffs, because of open trade. Our TVs have got bigger and the prices have got smaller. Our mobile phones have got more complex and more capable, while the prices have hardly changed. We have taken the benefits of not just free and open trade, but of global value chains and the integration of global trade for granted in recent times. And you've always got this trade-off between the ambitions of the liberalizers against the sacred cows of protectionists. But the bottom line is that protectionism is ultimately extremely inefficient and ineffective, even in domestic economies. If you have more protectionism, politically, what you end up with is industry worries about having better lobbyists to government, not having better products to sell to market. Ultimately, it is inefficient. It fails to take account of comparative advantage, and we wouldn't have made the huge advances we have in global trade and the availability of products to consumers. It's funny because very often the debate about trade fails to mention consumers. I sat in Davos a couple of years ago at a trade ministers meeting. It was 55 minutes before anyone said consumers in any way, shape or form. And we almost have forgotten that is one of the basic advantages of having trade, is that people can have a better choice of what they buy at better quality and at lower prices. That's what competition brings.
So you've defended the benefits of open trade, free trade in those first answers, but as you, I think, alluded to already, we are in a time where the WTO has probably never been under as much challenge as it is today. It's big supporting countries in the West, the United States in particular, has become incredibly skeptical about its value and insistent on the need for reform. The rise of protectionism and so on, you alluded to already. If you were to kind of lay out, I don't know, your top 3 challenges that you think the next Director General will face when he or she takes up their position, what would you have at the top of your list? What would be the top of the list of the inbox that you'd want to deal with if you were to be the next Director General?
Well, there are different types of issues. I think, first of all, one I mentioned, we have to reconnect with this vision about a shared endeavor. One of the dangers of undermining the multilateral system is not only that we see ourselves in a more fragmented way globally, but that the alternative to a multilateral system and a rules-based system is a free-for-all. And that's likely to help the very biggest players, or at least not harm the very biggest players. But countries, even big countries, will be very susceptible to a breakdown in that. So the United Kingdom, that exports 31% of our GDP, that imports 33% of our GDP, Germany, that exports 49% of GDP. This is not a breakdown in a system that would simply harm the smaller countries. This would harm some of the biggest countries as well, who are open to that global trading system at the present time. My lighting seems to be going off in the room, so we're going to be operating in the darkness. So that's one thing. So getting that shared vision and reconnecting to that shared vision is absolutely key. Secondly, I'm not sure if you can see me now.
Not currently, Liam. So if you're able to get the light working again, that'd be brilliant. But we can't see you currently. We can hear you perfectly. We can't see you.
Sorry. Yeah, you should be able to see me now.
You're coming back. We can hear you, but it's still dark currently.
Yeah, you should be getting lighter. We're working in a building where some of these our pictures stopped again.
Timer things, you mean? Yeah. Still, whatever you did before worked better. You're still dark. Oh, there we are. We got you.
Yeah, we're in a building where if someone's not moving in the room, the lights will go off.
Exactly.
This is the benefit of being environmentally friendly
Well,
at the present time.
You have to start waving at the right moment.
It is. I need someone to stay in my room to keep moving from time to time. So it's the vision thing, Robin. The first thing is making sure that we've got a commitment to that shared endeavour. Then we've got some of the practical issues to deal with, the appellate body, getting that up and running, because if you've got a rules-based system but you don't have a mechanism to adjudicate disputes within it, you're actually denying members one of the main value-added reasons that they have for being there in the first place. And so that needs to be done. And of course, we've got to deal with the magnitude of the COVID crisis and what that will mean across the global economy, the implications of which are only beginning, I think, to be understood at a macroeconomic level, and the specific impacts on trade. And the other issue, I think, is a much more domestic WTO issue about how we treat our members in Geneva. I've done about 73, I think, if I count this as a bilateral, which is taking a bit of a liberty, but if I count this, that would be 73 bilaterals I've done since we had the hustings in Geneva. And the message coming across to me time and time again is that small members who make a nuisance of themselves get listened to, big economies get listened to, and there are a group in the middle who don't feel that their voice is properly heard. Now, that may seem a housekeeping issue, but it's not, because this concept of that shared endeavour comes to fruition when you've got trust. That's a prerequisite, and trust is actually based on cooperation between members. And if members feel that they're not being listened to, they feel their voice is not being heard, their concerns are not at the top of the agenda, that trust starts to break down. But when I was still practicing as a doctor, medicine as a doctor, which you didn't mention at the beginning, but that was my pre-career, as my wife says, when you still had a proper job before politics. One of the things that you have to learn is if you don't listen to what your patients think is wrong with them, you won't be able to tell them what the diagnosis actually is. And I think that the lack of connection with members of the WTO at Geneva is quite a serious underlying problem. Maybe not something that would come to outsiders quickly, but I think that how we treat our own people is important. So there will be a full to overflowing inbox for whoever the next DG is. They will not be looking for work for very long.
That I have no doubt at all. I'm going to ask at least one more question, but at 12:40, I'm going to just let folks know that I will turn to questions. So as noted in the chat line on the side, do type your question into a Q&A. We're only taking questions on the Q&A function today for those of you who joined since we started. So just type your questions into the Q&A. You can always like somebody else's question if you want, and I will work my way through them when they come on. But you did mention the COVID context and this idea of needing to listen better to members. Are you concerned? I would think one of the big challenges is going to be is that members are going to be much more actively involved in their economies post-COVID than they were before, protecting consumers, focusing on resilience, closer supply chains to home. Are likely, are they not, to be part of the new future? What do you think the WTO is going to be able to do to get ahead of that wave? We could end up in a very messy world trade environment. Lots of members that the DG is listening to, a lot of members asking for particular consideration and protection. How do you deal with that COVID environment, Liam?
Well, I think your first point is absolutely correct, that governments will be much more concerned with their domestic issues, and that may make some of the current disputes take longer to settle. Actually, I think it is actually a good argument for saying we should go more quickly to try to take things off the table, because we're going to have new considerations. So perhaps we need to look at things like fisheries and agriculture to see whether we can expedite to the extent that we can. No small challenge, I accept, but there would be some logic in trying to do so. Governments will be preoccupied when the cost of intervention comes and their consideration about repayment of both sovereign and commercial debt starts to rise up the agenda. So I've no doubt about that. But I think you make, if I may say, the key point, which is about resilience. And I think that one of the things that we have learned is that the way in which we've organized global value chains, particularly just-in-time manufacturing chains, for example, has tilted the pendulum away from resilience towards efficiency. So I think there'll be some rebalancing of that. I think that's most likely to manifest itself by greater holding of stock. I think you will get some onshoring. That's likely to happen. But I think that the lesson there is back to comparative advantage. There's a reason why some big economies don't manufacture certain things, and that's because the fixed costs in their economies make it uneconomic to do so. Where I think the WTO will come in is in two ways. Number one is to actually make the case openly and constructively for the fact that resilience is to be found in greater diversity of supply. The more we try to onshore and do everything ourselves, the more we are literally putting everything in all our eggs in one basket. And if you try to be utterly self-sufficient, you had better hope that you're not the first country where the next new virus strikes, because you will be alone in terms of the global situation. So I think understanding that we do need to accept this reality of interdependence and interconnectivity and plan for global resilience in that way. There are some elements of global trade which have already been disturbed and which we cannot avoid. For example, simply the fact that so many container vessels were tied up at the beginning of the crisis in the Far East, which has meant a disruption of supply because of the length of time that takes. The fact that there has been less passenger traffic, meaning less air freight being carried, that will also have an effect on supply and probably price, as you would expect economically. And then we've got the simple human costs of lockdown itself. The fact that in lockdown, there are fewer SPS inspections being done, fewer technical barrier to trade certifications being done, less work being done on disputes over dumping, for example. So all these are disruptions inside the trading system. But what's common to everything we've talked about so far is that all these problems are not technical, they're political. All the issues we face, from the fisheries dispute to some of the elements of COVID and export restriction to the appellate body, all of them are political, which is why the reason that I'm standing in this race is I believe that an elected politician is best placed to understand how to go about dealing with these issues, whereas those with technocratic skills, of whom there are many tremendous minds at the WTO, have a different feel for how these situations occur. It's going to be a very difficult time, I think, for the WTO, as it will be for the global trading system, but understanding that these problems will need to be sorted out in capitals, not by internal discussions in Geneva, is a common thread running through all the issues that you've mentioned so far.
Thank you. I can feel the timer in your room going there, so I'm hoping, hopefully you've got somebody around there, you wave your arms. No one will mind if you have to wave your arm at some moment to keep the lights going. What I was going to say was just one more question for you, and we've got lots of good questions coming in from our audience right now, I'll turn to in a minute. But could you say a word or two about how you think of the interconnections between trade and the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs? I mean, there's going to be a critical moment in these next 5 years to really make progress towards the SDGs. Deep concerns that the COVID crisis might knock us backwards, or probably has already knocked us backwards on a whole bunch of areas. Where do you see the role of trade and the WTO itself in making that part of its DNA in a way and driving that forward? Could you just pick any part of the SDGs that you would like to draw off?
Well, I think if you go back to the Doha round, it was very clear what our aims were then. It was to get settlement in agricultural issues, to deal with tariffs in non-agricultural goods and services, but at the same time putting development at the heart of the organization. Now, I think that you therefore have to look and see what the WTO is and what the WTO is not. So it is there to deal with the application of trade rules. It is there to deal with disputes within the system and negotiation on how we liberalize global trade. But the WTO is not UNCTAD. It has a huge overlap in the developmental interests with groups like UNCTAD. It is not the World Bank. It's not the IMF. It is not the UN. And it is not the Security Council. So we've got to try to keep within the WTO the issues for which it's responsible and not allow, for example, disputes between members to spill over into the trading system. We need to keep that focus on development. We'll need to keep the focus on capital flows, because capital flows into developing countries are essential for their ability to mature and develop capability. We'll have to ensure that the development programs from individual countries are able to continue, and that we're able to ensure that we get training done. We have to ensure that we encourage more women into the global trading system. That's been one of my very passionate issues in recent years in supporting the She Trades Initiative and others, because that's not just an economic, it's also a developmental and social tool as well. So all of these things, I think that what you need to do is to take that core function of the WTO, recognize where it overlaps with the World Bank on finance and the IMF, recognize where it overlaps with UNCTAD on development, and looks at where through trade itself that can be an adjunct to what's happening elsewhere. Sometimes I think that we have a rather siloed view of what happens in the international institutions, and I think we need to get them to cooperate better together. That's not to try to get them all to do the same thing, but it's to try to get them to cooperate, if you like, in a Venn diagram where they overlap with one another in a more constructive way, utilizing data in particular. I mean, I'll give you a tiny element of where I think that's important. If you look at some of the small, vulnerable economies, one of their biggest problems that they will say is the way that they are categorized, for example, by GDP per capita. If you're in a coastal or an island community, you can have a very high GDP per head the day before your hurricane hits, and a very low GDP per head 6 months after. And it seems to me that we have to look at the data sets that we have. We need to look at how we measure that. For example, should we not be looking at a rolling 5-year GDP per head to give better predictability to some of the governments in these areas, so that they know what sort of trading preferences they will have as a consequence of these measurements? And I think that getting some of the institutions to work together in a more creative way, perhaps than we've had, is no bad thing. And again, when you've had to work as a G7 country at a global level in politics, then it sort of becomes your bread and butter as to how you think about that.
No, thanks for that answer. Look, I want to stick to time. It's the last 20 minutes is to get questions from our participants here, our members. Lots of good questions coming. Let me start with one by Tina Intelman. We've avoided the geopolitics a bit, but she asked the good question about how would you engage the big players like the US, China, and the EU in this agenda that you have set for yourself? Because the one thing we know is certainly the big players are daggers drawn at the moment. What would be your approach to dealing with the big players and getting them behind your agenda?
Well, again, it's about getting the political commitments, about getting them to understand that actually what their voters want is a successful economy. That a successful economy is best served by an open trading system. That's how consumer interests, as I said earlier, are best served. We do have quite severe global tensions in the system. Back in 2018, I made 5 visits as trade secretary to Beijing and 5 to Washington. And my message, whenever I was asked to take sides, was always the same, and said, my side is the rules-based system. Countries that operate within the rules-based system will get our support, but they will have to expect to be criticized if they operate outside that rules-based system. I can't emphasize enough just how important I think that multilateral rules-based system is because of the alternative. In terms of the US-China disputes, well, why do trade wars normally end? They normally end because the economic cost of sustaining them becomes too great for the parties involved. And, you know, I don't need to tell you, Robin, the amount of data that's out there from the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, that's producing estimates of how much 28% tariff rates being applied bilaterally may affect the GDP of both the US and China. In a global environment where the economies are growing quite well and global trade is growing, perhaps you might be able to sustain a 1.2% anchor on your GDP. Post-COVID, will that be the same, or will there be an additional pressure on the incoming American administration and Congress, whoever that is, as well as the Chinese, with a high need for good growth levels for social and political reasons? Will there be an increased pressure on them to be able to come to a compromise? I think that is certainly arguable, but I think we need to see where the COVID numbers take us, because I think so paradoxically, the worse the COVID crisis actually becomes, perhaps the greater the chance of resolving some of those bilateral differences, or at least an increasing pressure to come to the table to resolve them might become.
Thank you. Let me jump to another question by James Tudor White. It's the one that's at the top of our list right now, talking about the fact that UNCTAD has confirmed how much trade has contracted, or the biggest contractions last year since the 2008 financial crisis. What, in your opinion, are the most important measures to kickstart the economy and promote free trade, dismantle barriers? How can the Director General facilitate that dismantling of barriers? What would you have at the top of your first 100 days, should we say, of ways of using trade to promote that growth?
Well, the first is to deal with the COVID measures themselves. My worry, not least from political experience, is that there's nothing so permanent as temporary measures introduced in a crisis. We need to make sure that some of those restrictions are removed as quickly as possible, and that they all are removed in time. To help us do that, we need to improve notification. So our members need to notify WTO of the measures that they are introducing, whether export restrictions or other barriers to trade. I think I have 2 particular worries in that. One is the export of medicines, potentially how that would impact vaccines, were we to get to that point. And secondly, food. 30 countries in the world are now utterly dependent on the open trading system, not just to choose the food they want to buy, but to avoid starvation. 17% of the people on our planet require that open trading system. So it's not just about livelihoods, it can quickly become about lives as well. So we've got to make sure that we don't turn the COVID crisis into a humanitarian crisis around starvation. So that's I think the #1 priority. We've also therefore got to understand how we differ from where we were at the end of the financial crisis. Back in 2009, only 0.7% of G20 countries' imports were covered by restrictive measures. Now that doubled almost every 2 years, so that by the end of 2019, 10.3% of G20 countries' imports were covered by restrictive measures. That is a massive increase in the barrier to trade facing other countries in the trading system. And the G20 needs to learn to lead by example. I would not have any problem holding up a mirror to the G20 and saying, not only are you not moving quickly enough in the right direction, you're moving in the wrong direction. And we're now making it much more difficult for countries in the COVID crisis to trade their way out of poverty or to trade their way perhaps into livelihoods than we were at the end of the financial crisis. So, you know, you have to practice what you preach. And one of the key elements will be making that case to the G20. Now, this is not about making the case to G20 governments, but very often to the electorates and the people who genuinely do worry about what the impact of restricted trade on hunger, for example, or medicines might achieve. I was briefing members of Parliament at Westminster not long ago on this, and they were horrified that the UK was one of those G20 countries where we have to take responsibility for those measures being in place. So getting an understanding that we are in a bad place to start with. We're in a worse place than we were at the end of the financial crisis, and we're in danger through some of these protectionist measures of worsening what is, what, as you readily say, has been the potential impact on trade. Talk about constriction between 13 to 32% according to WTO figures. So wakening up, we cannot have business as usual. This is business unusual. Get real and get ready to deal with it.
Thank you for that point. There's lots of other questions coming in. I want to make sure I do them justice. Just to piggyback on that very quickly, if you could give a short answer to this, would you try to pick a particular sector at all? Do you think that there's a space where the WTO can play a particular role, either on digital trade or in some particular sectoral area where you could get everyone behind a moment of progress? Does that feature as part of your agenda, trying to find a space where you could make a bit of movement to show forward progress at this time of restriction?
Well, I think you have to look at the connected problems we face. We've got a trading crisis. As if that wasn't enough, we've got the COVID crisis, and for good measure, we've got the ongoing climate crisis. How do we look at, again, where those areas intersect? We could be sending some important signals. I think, for example, the Environmental Goods Agreement, which is a plurilateral involving 46 members, I think we could get that moving because it sends a signal about development, about reducing the cost to sustainable energy generation for developing countries. It says something about our commitment to the wider environment and the climate change issues, and it's probably doable. Is it possible to conclude a big multilateral? Well, possibly fisheries. But again, here's a point I would make perhaps instinctively as a politician. We've got a fisheries agreement, which is all about sustainability. We need to use strategic communications much better to get the NGOs and those billions of young people across the planet who really do worry about sustainability and the health of the oceans to be putting pressures on their governments to try to get this done. And what I said earlier, it's not just about what happens in Geneva, it's what happens in capitals and how we can get the global public to understand what is happening in trade can have an impact on issues way beyond what they may think traditionally constitutes a trading one. So I think EGA is really important because it's so totemic in many ways. It sends a lot of messages about how we understand that interaction between trading issues, between climatic issues and developmental issues. Fisheries would be another very good example, and they're probably the only two potentially doable ones, I would have thought, in the short term.
There's a lot of talk, just sticking to this issue for a second, there's a lot of talk in the EU in particular about establishing a border carbon adjustment mechanism to actually start to take the carbon content of imports and apply, in essence, a tariff depending on the differential between that content and the content, let's say, in EU countries. Where do you think the WTO should stand on the potential emergence of carbon tariffs, or let's call them carbon border adjustment mechanisms around the world? Something that should be supported as working towards SDG goals, or something that should be resisted because it's maybe a free-for-all? Where would you stand on that?
Well, you love to pick these complex ones to dissect, and you're quite right, because it is going to be a big issue. So for developed countries who may be offshoring manufacturing capability, which is in breach of many of the climatic targets that have been set, should a price be paid for that? Yes, it should, and it's entirely justifiable and understandably politically, and in terms of climate change, why we would want to do so. I think that where the difficulty in that would come would be in this concept of green subsidy, because you can easily turn what are distortive agricultural practices, which we want to get rid of, into subsidies for agriculture by another means, by calling it a green subsidy. So if it were purely in line with climate change objectives, that's one thing, but were it to become distortive in terms of trade in areas like agriculture, I think that would legitimately be part of the remit of WTO. You're right that it encompasses a number of different objectives and goals within that, and it's going to be quite a tightrope, I think, to walk as an issue. But then again, it's a political issue. It's not really about the technocratic skills. It's about our willingness to both accept that if we want to see the climate change objectives met, that there will be a price attached to that, and to try to divert it into something else would be to fail to, I think, meet the primary objective of some of those very laudable ideas.
Thank you for that answer. You advertised your political skills and your political experience as one of your strong suits for this for the position at WTO, and I expected that you would get at least one Brexit question, which will test your political skills, of course. Somebody did say, could I please read it out? So I will do Thomas Cole, the readout. So he notes in his question that you championed Brexit, but it's erecting barriers to trade between your native UK and its largest trading partner, the European Union. So how do you square the fact that you are a backer of raising barriers to trade with wanting to be Director General of the WTO, whose aim is to liberalize and promote trade? How do you square that contradiction is Tom Cole's question.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think it is a contradiction. I campaigned to leave the European Union purely for political reasons, for constitutional reasons. I always wanted us to have a full, comprehensive trade agreement with the European Union, which I still believe is in our bilateral interest to do. So I never wanted to see barriers to trade erected, and I still hope that in the negotiations we don't get erections of barriers to trade. My objection was purely about political control and constitutional control.
There will be some barriers. I mean, just to push it a little bit, there will inevitably be barriers once you leave. Even if there were a zero tariff arrangement with the EU, there would be barriers in terms of rules of origin. I mean, the customs controls, etc. So it is inevitable, isn't it, or not?
That's entirely possible. But again, you have to look against at what it might be counterbalanced against from the UK's point of view, and whether you get overall liberalisation elsewhere. But I would also say that I'm not a member of the UK government, and nor am I going to be the UK DG if elected. If I become selected, the UK will become one of 164 countries that will be treated without fear or favour by a DG who believes in the rules-based system and believes that everybody should be subject to those rules. And I think that, but understanding the political complexities is no bad thing when it comes to issues like Brexit or any number of other political problems where we have blockages in the trading system at the current time.
Another question here from Alex Folks, which was on the political dimension as well. Trade is more and more the weapon of choice for governments to pursue political objectives. And he notes here about the question of sanctions being increased more and more and being used, and they will probably be used, he mentions, against Belarus for any election rigging. It's been used against Russia for annexation of Crimea. It's being used by the US for Hong Kong. Where does the WTO going to position itself, and where do you think it should position itself in this expansion of trade as a kind of weapon, if you see what I'm saying, of political objectives?
Well, there are circumstances, as you know, within WTO rules where countries can use sanctions legitimately for political reasons. Where would I put it? I'd put it as a last resort. I go back to the point I made earlier, that the WTO needs to know what it is and what it isn't. It is there to ensure that we expand trade liberalization, that we apply global rules for trade, and that we adjudicate on disputes. If we, frankly, allow all our global institutions to be part of the same conversations and disputes between members, we'll end up all doing the same things. We'll end up all having the same conversation, and there'll be little point in differentiating between those institutions. So I think I would also say that understanding the role of trade in security, which I alluded to at the very beginning, trade is the lifeblood of the global economy. Trade is the bridge between prosperity and security. And while we may, in extremis, want to use restrictions of trade as a particular weapon against what are perceived as genuinely difficult global adversaries in whatever situation, I think we've got to be very reticent about doing so, because restrictions of trade will have consequences, and there will be victims, and there will be a price to be paid for doing that. So yes, within what is strictly allowed, but what we mustn't allow is for trade disputes to become the proxies for political or security disputes elsewhere. There is a danger in that. It's understandable that, and as a politician, I understand you cannot create a sterile environment inside each of the global institutions where those problems never spill over, but we ought to try to restrict them to the appropriate fora where we can.
I'm conscious you've got a hard stop at 1 and we've got 2 minutes left, so I think this will be our last question, and I'm going to just pull on an issue that wasn't covered in the list of questions next door. I think we've covered most of the issues that are there, and there's one about a UK-US FTA before the end of the year, which I think is probably not appropriate for you to answer unless you want to say something about that. But the key question, I think, in your role is this rise of regional trade agreements in parallel to the WTO. Where do you think, should the WTO be accommodating, working with the regionalization of trade? We have a new Africa continental agreement, we've got a CPTPP, obviously, etc. Is this helpful, or are you worried that in a way the WTO, it needs to reassert its discipline and fight this spread of regionalization?
Well, the WTO is a multilateral organization. Therefore, a multilateral agreement is the gold standard. And that is what we are committed as an organization to try to do. It's at the heart of all the assumptions about the creation of the WTO. It was at the heart of the understanding of the Doha round, and has continued to be at the center of thinking. At the ministerial conference, which I attended in Buenos Aires, we reached the point, however, where in some attempted multilateral agreements, it simply was being held back by a small number of members. And I remember Ambassador Lighthizer memorably saying at that, well, there's no point trying to take hostage when no one's willing to pay the ransom. That, in other words, that we needed to make progress in areas like e-commerce, where the initiative moved forward after that. And I remember having a conversation with the DG, Roberto Azevêdo, in Argentina at the time, about this concept of multilateral versus plurilateral versus regional versus bilateral in terms of agreements on trade. And my view was that if you saw plurilateral agreements as an alternative to multilateral, then you were missing the point of the WTO. If you saw plurilaterals as providing a stepping stone by which members would ultimately reach a multilateral, that was a different concept. So in my mind, I see a very clear range of these agreements, multilateral being at the top. I see the next one in the division down as being open plurilateral agreements that will lead to multilateral agreements. Then we have regional trade agreements, and then we have bilateral trade agreements. Some of these are done out of frustration at the lack of multilateral progress. I've always seen the regional trade agreements as being, again, stepping stones to creating a multilateral, open, liberal, free and fair trading environment. And I think that some liberalization is better than none, but multilateral is better than everything else. And it takes me back neatly to the very first point I was making. We can only do this, and we can only operate multilaterally if we have a genuine concept of a shared endeavor and the vision that will allow us to have the trust necessary to make the compromises upon which a multilateral agreement depends. And if every country puts its own national interests exclusively at the center of its thinking, we will not have the space to do that. And we should remember those billion people that we did take out of extreme poverty, and not only the responsibilities we have to take them to the next level of prosperity, but that it's not only economically, but in my view, morally reprehensible to say we have benefited from that free and open trading system. We're now going to pull up the ladder behind us. So it is a political judgment, and in many ways it's a moral judgment too. So whatever happens in this election at the WTO, over the next few years, it is going to literally be an existential period for the multilateral trading system.
Liam, thank you very much indeed for answering those questions. We're taking a little bit past your 1 o'clock deadline. I know you've got a lot of other calls to make and a lot of other discussions to have. Thank you very much for taking us both into the philosophy behind your position, but also your connection to security, that idea of trade being central to this as well. And I think your hierarchy, I'll use that term, of different types of agreements and how you see those playing out. Good luck to you, as good luck to all of the candidates with their pushes, over the coming weeks to be able to get their messages across. Just to remind everyone on the call that we do have another one the day after tomorrow with Abdelhamid Mamdouh from Egypt. And we have Yoo Myung-hee, the South Korean minister, just before the end of the month. But all of these things will be sent out to you. For the moment, I want us to do a very big thank you to Dr. Liam Fox for taking the time to take a lot of questions on top of the rest. And thank you to our members for joining us and asking some very good ones as well along the way. Please join me in thanking Liam Fox virtually. You won't hear them, Liam, but thank you very much indeed for taking the time and sharing your thoughts with us and getting these ideas into the mix. I'm delighted we're having the debate.
Thank you, Robin, and here's to the WTO scoring its century. Thanks.
Exactly. Thanks very much. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.